Hello, everybody. So this week we are leaving the West behind. Last week we learned about westward expansion. We learned about the Mexican-American War and the Alamo. We learned about the California Gold Rush, and we learned about the Oregon Trail. This week we are going to move on from that and learn about the Civil War, or more specifically, learn about the beginning and the causes of the Civil War. Like I taught you during the Revolutionary War, wars don't just happen. Nobody wakes up one morning hating another group of people and decides to make war on them. Wars build. Causes and insults build over years and years and years. And civil wars even more so, because most wars are a war between two different countries. A civil war is a war between one country and another part of that same country. That is what a civil war is. A civil war is not a war between two different groups of people. A civil war is a war between the same group of people. And civil wars often cause even more lasting damage and even more lasting hatred and grudges than regular wars. And this is the case with the Civil War. The Civil War is 150 years old, 155 years old, and we are still talking about it in our culture, in our politics, in our debates. Just this year, another bill came up as to whether or not to remove the statues in the war. Some people think it's their heritage. Some people think it's insulting. And I can't tell you where the answer is because it's a little bit of both. During the Revolutionary War, we had a clear bad guy. That bad guy was the British Empire. The British Empire was taking away our rights. There are bad guys in the Civil War, but I want you to remember that both sides of the Civil War were Americans. So let's begin. This is a weird word that I have up here, antebellum. What in the world does that mean? Most of you, I bet, have never heard that word before. Well, antebellum means before the war. This period in America is called antebellum, which is a fancy Latin word which just means before the war. This period in America lasts from about 1826 to about 1861 when the Civil War started. Now, question, why was the Civil War fought? Tell me out loud. If you said slavery, you are mostly correct. Yes, the Civil War was fought over slavery, but it wasn't the only reason the Civil War was fought, and it wasn't the reason the Civil War was, well, it was the reason the Civil War was started, but it wasn't the reason the North went to war. The North went to war to keep the country together. The South went to war because it wanted to be a different country. Slavery did start the reasons for the war, though. Causes of the Civil War, here we have slavery, states' rights, Paris, the Dred Scott decision, bleeding Kansas, the raid on Harper's Ferry, and the election of Abraham Lincoln. So, to understand slavery, we need to understand this. This is cotton, or King Cotton, as it used to be called before the Civil War in the antebellum period. Cotton is a plant. It is a little flower that has threads in it. And over here on the left, we have a single cotton stalk, and these are the bolls of the cotton. Over on the right, we have a cotton field in Alabama. Cotton was America's chief export. It was our cash crop. If you remember in elementary school, learning about how tobacco was a cash crop in Virginia during the 1600s and the colonial periods, well, cotton was America's cash crop during the early 1800s. And we exported cotton to the entire world. It made us very rich. To export means that you are selling this to another country. To import means you're buying something from another country. X means out, M means in. So to export, you're sending stuff out. So we sent cotton to the British Empire, to the French Republic, and all over the world because of how good our cotton was. Before cotton, people had very limited options of their clothing. There was burlap for the very poor people. Burlap is very scratchy, and it is not a good thing to wear. There was wool. Now, some of you may have wool coats. I have a wool coat. Wool is heavy. Wool is hot. Wool is scratchy. And wool, when it gets wet, it takes forever to dry. Now, wool is wonderful because wool is warm. And in the winter, it's very comfortable to wear wool. In the summer, it is not comfortable to wear wool. And the very, very rich people in the world could afford to wear silk. But silk is only grown in China. At this point in time, it was still very expensive to get to China. Silk is still very expensive. If you remember, we learned about Marco Polo and how he brought back silk and pepper to the West. Well, it has stayed very expensive, and most people could not afford silk. So when America discovered cotton, cotton grew well in the United States, and we started mass producing it and making clothing. This is a cotton shirt that I'm wearing. I want you all to check your shirts right now and see if they're cotton. Go. I would say that most of your shirts were cotton. But cotton had a problem. It was very difficult to grow it. It ate up the soil, and it was very difficult to harvest it. To harvest means to pick it. And laborers, whether slave or free, had to individually pick off the boll. This is the boll part, and they had to pull it apart into little threads. And this took a long, long time. Number one, you had to pick each part, you had to take the seeds off, you had to make sure pieces of the stock were there, and then you had to pick it apart. And this would take hours until the invention of the cotton gin. Now, the cotton gin was a machine that was invented in 1793 by a man named Eli Whitney. And you can see it here. Part of it has a glass case. This would have been encased in a wood case back then, but you would turn this crank, drop the cotton in, turn the crank, and the machine would separate the boll from the seeds and the pieces of stock and even unwound the threads itself. Eli Whitney did this because he wanted to make slaves' life easier, and it did at first, but it had unintended consequences. We're going to watch a video about those consequences.
How does one measure progress? When looking at how technology has changed society, it's always been for the better, right? Technology frees us. It gives us back time we might not have had. It makes life easier. Everyone benefits from technology, don't they? Would anyone disagree? The Industrial Revolution was a major turning point in history. Social, economic, and cultural conditions were profoundly impacted by changes in many industries. One invention in particular played a major role in these changes, but it also came with a number of unintended consequences. After the American Revolution, many hoped the ideals of freedom and equality would extend to the slave population. It was generally thought that slavery was an outdated and dying institution, and many Southern leaders opposed it. Planters feared slave revolts, and farmers realized it was more expensive to maintain slaves compared to the value of what they could produce. At that time, cotton was a difficult crop for planters because removing the seeds was a grueling and exhausting process involving many slaves. Long staple cotton was the easiest to pick and remove seeds. Still, it took slaves 10 hours to remove the seeds from 1 pound of cotton lint. In 1793, while tutoring on a Georgia plantation, a man named Eli Whitney created an invention which he believed would make cleaning cotton easier and would lessen the need for slaves. That invention, the cotton engine, or cotton gin for short, was a mechanical device that separated cotton fibers from cotton seeds and dramatically lowered the cost of producing cotton fiber. According to Whitney,
this gin, if turned with horses or by water, 2 persons will clean as much cotton in one day as 100 persons could clean in the same time.
However, what actually happened as a result of this invention could not have been predicted. In England, the Industrial Revolution sparked a number of inventions in the textile industry, which enabled textiles to be mass-produced and made Britain's need for cotton so insatiable that cotton became vital to the American economy. The gin's effect on the economy and on the lives of the slaves who made up a significant part of that economy was complex. While it was true that the cotton gin freed slaves from the arduous labor of separating seeds from the lint by hand, this increased demand for cotton also increased the demand for slaves needed to grow it and harvest the fields.
Oh, when the cotton goes get rotten, you couldn't pick very much cotton, and the more cotton field at home. It was down in Louisiana, just a mile from Texarkana, and the more cotton field at home.
At the turn of the century, American cotton production was at 75,000 bales. However, by mid-century, America was growing 75% of the world's supply of cotton, about 4 million bales. This boom in production directly related to an increased demand for slaves. The number of slaves in America increased from 750,000 in 1790 to well over 4 million by 1860. By then, approximately 1 in 3 Southerners was a slave. Cotton plantations were a miserable life for slaves. On the large cotton plantations, both the work and the punishments were incessant and unforgiving. Beatings were often used to coerce uncooperative slaves, along with selling off their families, mutilation, and even death. Former slave Henry Bibb wrote in his autobiography,
I have known the slaves to be so fatigued from labor that they could scarcely get to their lodging places from the field at night, and then they would have to prepare something to eat before they could lie down to rest. By the time they would get their suppers, it would be midnight, and they would herd down all together and take but 2 or 3 hours rest before the overseer's horn called them up again to prepare for the field.
Hey, hi, ho, picking cotton all day. Hey, hi, ho, just a picking away. Oh, white folks knows I'm working. They know it's gonna be no jerking. Hey, hi, ho, picking cotton all day. Hey, hi, ho, just a picking away.
Former slave Mary Reynolds remembered, it was work hard, get beatings, and half fed. The times I hated most was picking cotton when the frost was on the boughs. My hands get sore and crack open and bleed. And as cotton cultivation spread, slaveholders in the tobacco belt, whose crop was no longer lucrative, made huge profits by selling their slaves. This domestic slave trade devastated black families, who were ripped apart and sent hundreds of miles away. There is no simple method to determine how the cotton gin affected the lives of individual slaves, and while it is possible that the invention of the gin made the working hours of a few individual slaves somewhat less difficult, given the cruelty of slavery overall, it is clear that any invention which encouraged slavery to grow and expand, increased the misery of slaves exponentially. Furthermore, due to its inadvertent effect on slavery, the invention of the cotton gin is frequently cited as one of the ultimate causes of the American Civil War. So while most people may agree that technology equals progress, for people of African descent, the cotton gin was not progress. It was a further entrenchment into slavery.
Trouble so hard, ooh Lord, trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God.
So the cotton gin's unintended consequences was the actual spread of slavery. Now, before I move on, let me be absolutely clear. Slavery was wrong. Slavery was the biggest mistake America ever made. Slavery is holding other humans in bondage for profit, and it is wrong. So, in the beginning, we can see in 1789. 1789 is significant because it is the year that George Washington was elected as our first president. We can see in red, we have slave states, and in blue, we have free states. Now, the slave states outnumbered the freed states 8-5. Down at the bottom, we have the number of slave states and the number of free states, and we can look at the map and see the where slavery existed. Now, slavery existed mostly in the South, but it would be wrong to say that slavery only existed in the South. In the beginning, slavery existed almost everywhere. In fact, the years that we see here, we have Massachusetts, 1783, Pennsylvania, 1780, Connecticut, 1784. Those are the years that slavery was banned in those states. But New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland were all slave states. New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland would be northern states during the Civil War. They would side with the Union or the North. These were slaveholding states. Now, New York, New Jersey would eventually get rid of slaves. However, Delaware and Maryland would have slaves up until the end of the Civil War, even though they sided with the North. Here we have, I apologize, it's a bit blurry. 11 years later, we can see Kentucky and Tennessee have broken off from Virginia and North Carolina, respectively. New York has gotten rid of slavery. And slavery has become more of a Southern institution. And the slave states were 9 and the free states were 8. Now, 1821. 1821 is the year that people really started arguing over slavery. We can see that all of the New England and some of the mid-Atlantic states have stopped slavery. Delaware and Maryland, however, remain slave states. During this time, the North became a manufacturing center, became an urban center. Lots of people were moving there. Irish, German, British immigrants were moving there. And they provided low wage labor, so they A, didn't need slaves, and B, if you remember from our geography lessons, this area was not good for farming. So they started building factories that made guns, that made ships, that made tools, all sorts of things up north. So they didn't really need the slaves. Down south, sadly, the entire economy started to depend on slavery. Now, most of the people in the South thought that slavery was wrong. And in fact, only 1 out of every 4 people in the South owned slaves. However, the very rich were the ones that were owning slaves, and they were the ones whose slaves were making them money, and they didn't want to give up their money. From here on, the South and the North start to argue about slavery. And their compromise, and we will learn about this in a minute, is to make sure there are always an equal number of slave states and free states so one side doesn't start telling the other side what to do. See, we have 1837. There are 13 slave states and 13 free states. We can also see the Republic of Texas. If you recall from last week, Texas was its own country. 1846, we've now gained Texas and the Wilmot Proviso from Mexico. And here is where the problem starts. California comes into the country as a free state and unbalances the power between the free states and the slave states. Now we have 17 to 15 free states over slave states. And here we have 1861, the year that the Civil War starts. So I'm going to talk about abolitionists for a minute. Abolitionists were people who worked to end slavery. And slavery is morally wrong. And it is. Slavery is morally wrong. This picture says, am I not a man and a brother? Yes, he is. He is both, and it is wrong to treat people like animals. Among the most famous abolitionists, we're going to talk about three of them. The first one is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman ran the Underground Railroad. Now, most of you have heard of the Underground Railroad, and I am very sorry to tell you that the Underground Railroad is not as cool as it sounds. It was not a huge underground railroad. It was a underground just being secret. So it was a secret way to help slaves escape. It would have been really cool, though, if there was like massive caverns going from the deep south to the north carrying slaves and helping them escape. That would have been awesome. However, Harriet Tubman did help 200 slaves escape, which is pretty cool in itself. Then we have William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison ran a newspaper. If you don't know what newspapers are, ask your grandparents. They are kind of gray things that people read in front of their faces, and they like to do this with them. It makes a noise. The newspaper advocated for immediate emancipation. There's a new word that we need to learn, emancipation. Emancipation means freeing of the slaves. Immediate means right now. So he wanted to free all the slaves right now. Some abolitionists wanted gradual emancipation. That means they would free maybe a quarter of the slaves this year. 5 years down the road, we free another quarter of the slaves. 5 years down the road, another quarter. And in 5 years from now, it's 5 years from then, another quarter. So in 20 years, everybody would be free. That would give time for the economy to adjust, is what they thought. William Lloyd Garrison said, no, slavery is evil, and we need to get rid of it right now. And man who agreed, one of the greatest Americans of all time, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a brilliant orator. He was a slave, born a slave, escaped, and educated himself and started speaking on the evils of slavery. He also ran a newspaper called the North Star. The North Star wanted emancipation, but it also wanted votes for women. Back then, women did not vote in elections. They were not allowed to vote in elections. Only men were allowed to vote in elections. That is not the way today. Now we believe that everyone is created equal. Man, woman, black, white, everybody. But back then it wasn't so. Frederick Douglass believed that everyone was created equal. All right. So another cause of the Civil War was states' rights. If you remember way back when we learned about the Revolutionary War, we learned that each of these 13 colonies originally was its own country. The nation of Virginia the nation of Maryland, the nation of New York, the nation of Massachusetts, the nation of um, North Carolina. And the reason that they came together as one was to fight the British. And as soon as the war was over, they split again into 13 separate countries. And we decided to come together again after that didn't work. If you recall, the Articles of Confederation didn't work. There were several rebellions. Some people thought we should rejoin the British. The British were taking advantage of us. And because of this, we made the Constitution. However, a lot of people thought that since we voluntarily joined together, then we could voluntarily leave again. If Virginia joined the Union on its own, Virginia could leave the Union on its own. And today, we all think of ourselves as Americans. But back then, we didn't. Back then, you were a citizen of your state. This is very important. A lot of teachers overlook this, but this is the reason why so many people fought the Civil War in the South when they had no say in slavery. Remember, only about 1 in 4 people in the South owned slaves, but almost every single man in between 18 and 40 fought in the Civil War. Why is that? Because of their patriotism to their state. I would not have thought of myself as an American. I would be a Virginian. You all would be Virginians. That is the difference between now and then. Back then, people had patriotism, not for their nation, but for their state. We would be Virginians. When the Union Army, when the North Army invades Virginia, that they invaded our country. It would be the same as the Bostonians thought during the Revolutionary War. It does not excuse for the evil of slavery, but it explains why so many people were willing to fight. Now, many people thought that the government was getting too big. Like I said before, we thought of ourselves as members of states, not the federal government, not Washington, D.C. People would listen to Richmond, not Washington, D.C. And the federal government, the president, and Washington, D.C. started telling the states what to do, and they didn't like that. Again, you wouldn't understand this if you didn't understand that your loyalty belonged to Virginia or North Carolina or New Jersey. That is where your loyalty lay. Now, the North became more populous than the South. Virginia was the most populous state during the Revolutionary War. But immigrant ships, that's ships filled with people from Europe who wanted to start a new life in America, started landing in New York and Boston. Particularly German and Irish settlers started living in New York and Boston, and Italian, although the Italians came later. And the North became much more populous. That means more people lived in it. That means more people were able to vote. And that means they started favoring Northern politics over Southern politics. Now, in 1820 was the first real cause of the Civil War, and this is called the Missouri Compromise. Let me move my window there so you can see it. Missouri Compromise. And to keep the North and the South happy, the country decided it would have an equal number of free and slave states. That way, the South might be outnumbered in the House of Representatives, but it would always be equal in the Senate. Now, Missouri came in as a slave state, and Maine was admitted as a free state. This kept people equal. The next big problem was the Tariff of 1820. Now, a tariff is a taxes that's placed on imports. Imports are goods from another country. So if you wanted people to only buy American-made goods, you would place an import on foreign goods. Say China today can make things for cheaper than America can. That's true. China can make stuff cheaper than we can. That's because China doesn't pay its employees as well as America does. So people are buying Chinese goods. If we wanted to stop that, we would place a tariff on these goods. That way, the taxes on these goods would make those goods more expensive than American-made products. I'm going to go for a few more minutes. I know that I've almost hit a half an hour, but the Tariff of 1828 was a protective tariff passed by Congress in 1828. It was designed to help the North. The South, the southern states, were buying farm equipment from Europe and from the Caribbean that was cheaper than the factories in the North made. The North was mad about this, so they placed a tax on the South to protect themselves. This made the South very mad. The South did not like paying taxes to protect Northern industries. And this will be the last, let's see, 2 slides. And a few years later, we had the Compromise of 1850. In 1850, California wanted to come into the Union as a free state, but there was no slave state to balance it out. So the southern states, the southern senators, decided to agree to let California into the Union if the North passed a law that said all escaped slaves had to return to their masters. And the northern policemen had to help make that happen. In other words, the North was just told that they had to go out and find escaped slaves. Well, this made the North very mad. And we are going to stop here today and continue on the reasons of the Civil War next time. Hope you have a great day. Bye.